Hello, everyone, and welcome to my podcast, Scott Parker Goes Live. For those who don't know me, I've been called a covert human rights campaigner. Others, I expect, describe me more as a social entrepreneur and thought leader who invented the first business-owned disability network and has a long career persuading senior executives that treating people properly, including people with disabilities, is good for business, and then showing them how. Some argue that I have supped with the private sector devil so long, with that famous long spoon, that I have in fact gone over to the dark side. Whatever you call me, after some 30 years hacking away at this, I'm still asking the questions that I think really matter. Why is it so hard to get "and what about disability" into the ethical and responsible AI debate? Why do so many of the diversity managers who describe diversity as a choice choose not to tackle disability discrimination? And since when is treating people fairly and with respect defined as a choice? Well, I guess you could argue not robbing a bank is a choice. Why do we have health conditions and it's other people who have disabilities? And why do we just take it for granted that HR practitioners don't have a clue about the impact of disability discrimination on, well, their human resources? I don't know about you, but I expect a doctor to know the difference between your elbow and your knee. And with all that said, let's dive into this episode. So I'm delighted today to have with me Phyllida Swift from Face Equality International. And I'm so looking forward to our conversation, Phyllida. Of course, we've got thoughts about how we're going to structure this, but we're basically going to make this up as we go. Because, of course, looking back, I worked so closely with the founder of Face Equality International, James, who, of course, helped to set up the first such organization at national level in the UK. It's really exciting for me to see how far you've taken this idea, this concept of having a truly globalized institution promoting equality for people with facial disfigurement in such a short time. Because, of course, I start by being struck by how disfigurement on the impact of humanity has so often been overlooked. Remember, I told you I had a conversation with a fellow from Canada who had been absolutely at the heart of all the discussions about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I asked him at a session in Toronto, so tell me, are you convinced that the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UN Convention, actually protects people with facial disfigurement? And he looked at me and kind of went white and said, my God, it never came up. We never discussed it at all.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of backdrop to our conversation today. But first, I want to ask that you introduce yourself. So you're Chief Exec of Face Equality International. And what else do we need to know about you before we start the conversation?
Well, that's the top line for sure. So I guess I've been working in this space pretty much ever since I got my own lived experience. I have facial scarring, which I sustained in a very similar kind of parallel way to James. In a car accident, I was 22. And I was in my final year of university studying something completely irrelevant to what I do now. And I started volunteering for Changing Faces. I started fundraising. I started sharing my story. And that just kind of evolved. And I applied one day for a role that I saw on Instagram for a campaigns officer at Changing Faces. And I thought, yeah, sure, I could do that. And got it and got promoted.
And so how long ago was that?
This would have been, so the car accident was in 2015, and I think I started working there in 2017, a couple of months before the first ever Face Equality Day. So yeah, 2017 was when I started officially working there. Worked there for a couple of years. Wanted to go and do something different for a little while, and then immediately got poached by James, who said to me, oh, I've just started this little thing called Face Equality International. Maybe you could just come and do 5 hours a week for me running the social media. Did that with him for about 18 months before he died, and threw my name into the hat when no one knew what the future of the charity would look like. And I've been running it for 3 and a bit years now.
3 and a bit years, and you've taken it really from just that first conversation, if you like, with a few members where we had that global consultation in London. And I can remember vividly, because I was helping to chair it, saying something to the audience. It was the members from around the world working on behalf of people with facial difference, facial disfigurement. And I said the word disability. And a young woman looked at me and said rather sharply, "I'm not disabled. I have facial difference." I thought, well, that's interesting. So I asked the room, how many of you are going to use the word disability? And how many of you are going to use the word facial difference? And the room split pretty much 10 and 10. So I set up that formal debate, remember, where I got them to, this group said, we're going to use the word disability in order to get legal protection, etc. This group said, never am I ever going to use that term. I have enough trouble as it is. And the vote at the end was the same, 10 and 10, but people had switched sides. So as we're looking at your organization now, Face Equality International, tell us a bit about it and where is it going in terms of this debate? You've got what, about 40 members now? What's the
Yes.
pitch? Why do they join? What is it all about?
We first and foremost capacity build. So all of the organisations that we work with are charities, non-profits, support groups, who deliver some form of service to the disfigurement community, be that surgical, psychosocial, sometimes financial aid. They have very little capacity often to engage in societal change. They're very focused on the direct needs of the community in the here and now. We come in to help them campaign. We run an International Face Equality Week each year. We run an annual forum, which is that event where you had that initial consultation. And then as and when there are opportunities to lobby, to raise the profile of the disfigurement community, we do so, and we provide opportunities for them to influence the United Nations and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or feed into research, and essentially build the movement and that critical mass that is required to make societal change. And we have a very different model, and I'm not ashamed to say it, that at this very point in time, the organisations that exist are very much focused on that model of fixing the person, to be brutal about it. And we are focused on fixing society. So we're not reliant on that model of telling the person that they need to have to cope to live in a broken world, which inherently makes people feel broken. We're focused on that model of, no, well, actually society should accept us as we are. So that's the model that we work towards.
And so it's called Face Equality International. So are you protected under equality legislation? Where does that debate?
Sadly, I don't think the debate will ever be truly over. We do have some research which is now on our website, which came off the back of an 18-month-long consultation with our members, and beyond. And the problem is that disfigurement is not universally regarded as a disability, either legally or socially. And that is made ever more complex by the way that people identify. As you said, theoretically, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and that human rights model and the social model, a disfigurement is fundamentally aligned with the social model of disability, in the sense that there are attitudinal barriers in society, be that in the workplace, in education systems. Representation in the media is appalling. But the problem is that currently even UN CRPD ratified countries are very focused on that medical model, where what little case law does exist goes to show that unless someone can prove that their disfigurement is having an ability on that, having an impact on their ability to work, they are often having their cases dismissed.
But if I can come in there, you said ability to work, because of course, when we were campaigning to bring disfigurement into the UK's legislation, the Disability Discrimination Act, as was, the premise of the legislation, and in many countries, is you have to prove that your condition has an adverse impact on your ability to do day-to-day things, activities, whereas actually most people with facial disfigurement can still jump over fences, lift big things, see everything, hear everything, right? It's just that they encounter pure prejudice, right? The discrimination triggered by, I don't like the way you look, regardless of whether or not you're perfectly capable of doing this job. And so we did manage to get the UK to put it in, but to explicitly reference them on that legislation, but I doubt very much that it's explicit in the UK anymore. What are the implications for people with disfigurement of not having that protection? I mean, what do you see as you're traveling the world? Because you were recently in Nepal and Mexico.
There is also this perception that disfigurement is purely cosmetic and thereby doesn't have the medical reality and the disabling nature of a disfigurement. So for instance, I visited several hospitals in Mexico who were receiving calls from their patients who had cleft lip or palate or craniofacial conditions, which, if you don't know what that is, the medical reality of it is that you need some form of surgical intervention to eat, to be able to speak, and thereby you might need, well, you will likely, if you have a cleft palate, need ongoing speech therapy. So the medical reality of this is very real, and there needs to be that intervention. So patients and families are asking their surgical providers for a form of kind of certification, a letter to be able to go and seek kind of disability benefits, social security benefits, because if someone is in a remote community and thereby needs to travel to receive medically necessary care, that has a cost on the person. If they are attending to their land, for example, and that is how they make money, they physically cannot travel. So what we're seeing is that babies are essentially either malnourished, or they are being, in worst case scenario, left to die because they are too much of a financial burden on the family to be able to seek treatment. And governments do not recognize cleft as a disability because theoretically it can be quote unquote fixed. And the charities that exist, the likes of Smile Train, who funded this project, who deliver free cleft lip and palate surgeries around the world so that a child can eat, for example, they are propping up the government, and they mean that then means that the government are not responsible for having to recognize this community as a community facing human rights violations, as a community with a disability. And the same goes for in India and Nepal, where, for example, skin conditions, so a very rare skin condition called ichthyosis, which causes kind of almost lesions on the skin if someone does not have access to vital but very expensive creams. So again, this is an example of where something that is appearance affecting is regarded to be solely cosmetic. It's not regarded to be what it should be, which is the Indian legal definition of multiple disabilities, because it has an impact on someone's ability to see. There is creams and thereby costs attached to living with this condition, and yet again seeking disability status and thereby benefits is utterly dismissed. And we're trying to, I guess, build greater evidence, and thanks to having met a woman who lives with this skin condition, who runs a grassroots support group for people in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, we're gaining a deeper understanding into just how, I guess, neglected this community is. And as a result, this support group leader in India now is engaging with lawyers and people that were instrumental in actually crafting the CRPD in India. And again, it's been overlooked. This is a whole community that is just constantly overlooked.
And it's overlooked by the disability rights movement as well. But I wanted to come back on the example you just gave, where the individual needs expensive creams. So if you listen to people with albinism in Africa, they're saying to employers that given many jobs available to anybody in Africa, take us out into the sunshine, that what we need as an adjustment from the employer is sun blocking cream. Now that's an approach that says my skin is going to burn. Is that like a lesion? Is that a medical issue? Or is it that some of this cream from many employers is really quite affordable and they could just hand the cream out to everybody because they don't want any of their workers to get sunburned while out in the Nigerian sun. So it takes us back to this muddle, isn't it, about the medical versus the rights-based approach that says actually the question for an employer shouldn't be, what is your diagnosis, albinism or a rare condition? The question for the employer is, you can do the job if I give you some skin cream, and I can afford that. So where does that take us? I think that's the essence of it for me, is where the boundaries are between purely medical and a rights-based approach, if you like, that says the employer is legally obliged, or at least ethically obliged in some places, to just make a reasonable adjustment.
Well, then again, that further proves the point that on both of those grounds, a disfigurement needs to sit within the disability umbrella, whether it is a rights-based or a medical approach. It needs to cut across all of those different spheres. And yet, sadly, at this point in time, it doesn't.
Well, and for me, the essence of the difference is if an employer thinks you're sick, they appropriately send you home. You've got the flu. Send you home till you get better. Most employers don't send deaf people home to get better, right? There's an understanding. The question, if you're good at disability management, is, okay, you've just been diagnosed with MS. That's a pity. What can we do here in the workplace that would make it easier for you to keep your job while the medics do their thing? How do we get the same kind of thinking into your world?
Yes, well, of course. So similarly, necessary time off of work for whatever treatment or and what we're completely neglecting here, and this is where it gets even murkier, is the psychosocial impact of looking different in a workplace. And again, the, I don't know, microaggressions that go on in a workplace, or perhaps even the associated social anxiety that might come with looking different in a world where people are treated really badly. So could that be regarded as a reasonable adjustment? You know, we've heard discrimination cases where people are wrongfully dismissed because they would not be able to commit to regularly meeting clients or going out in highly social settings which are really demanding, where they might feel exposed. And again, those are theoretically discrimination cases where that reasonable adjustment has not been put in place, but it's not working. Or these cases are often, as we see, they're settled out of court, so the case law is not there.
Right. Well, I'm a firm believer that we need legislation which is credible in the eyes of both business and people with disability, and that in effect it teaches us how to treat people properly. That's really what the game is, right?
Mhm.
That I don't prejudge people, and I give them the opportunity to prove what they can do, and I adapt for human reality in a reasonable and sensible way. So what interests me in all of this, of course, is, do you think the phrasing facial difference is going to have is more likely to encourage fair and equal treatment than the phrase facial disfigurement or the phrase facial disability? How does the campaigner in you react to these nuances of language?
Yeah, it's really nuanced, and the problem is that it will constantly evolve, and we are international. So, you know, where we have disfigurement enshrined in the Equality Act in the US, it will likely be deformity that is more used, versus that's a big no-no here. So I honestly, the less we burden ourselves and with constantly talking about language, the better. Like, let's focus
Excellent.
on the matter at hand, which is the discrimination, the injustice, the social barriers that exist. Let's not focus on policing language, because we're just going to get in our own way. and we will never all agree. I absolutely wholeheartedly reclaim the term disfigurement personally, because it is not the word itself that is stigmatizing, it is the perception. It is. So yeah, I would much rather we just focus on the matter at hand. That said, I do understand why people have reservations and why there is this, of course, inherent negative association with the term disfigurement. And when it is used in a derogatory way, of course, of course.
Okay. So thinking of you as a campaigner and just moving on a little bit, you have been, I think, one of the first to spot, or at least articulate the fact that so many of your constituents, if we can call your folk that, are experiencing being disappeared on social media. They're being wiped out, their faces erased. Tell us about that and what's happening in that area.
Yes, so we've obviously spoken about human prejudice, which is one thing, which we're, yes, seemingly not erasing anytime soon, but the problem is now it's translated into machines. So on social media, on every social platform that exists currently, AI cannot distinguish between what is truly violent or graphic content, the likes of self-harm, for example, and what is just a human face. Burn survivors, for example, people with craniofacial conditions, are having their content blurred out and marked as sensitive, violent, graphic content, and often this is not reportable in the same way that a hate speech is online, for example. There isn't necessarily a function to report this to social platforms. When it is reported, it's difficult to get through to a human. And also, often the solution from social media platforms is to continue to kind of shadow ban or make content less visible. We've had conversations with every social platform about this being an issue on their channels, and yet we're still seeing it. And we have a basic understanding of the issue, which is that data sets that inform AI and inform AI as to what a human face is are not diverse enough. They are built on a very narrow kind of view of what is perhaps symmetrical, for example. And the impact of that on a human level is, of course, dehumanizing, to be told your face doesn't register as a human face. And whilst I say that, this is also an issue in lots of other spaces, whether it's photo ID verification, passport gates, yeah, etc., etc. But on a societal level, for an already marginalized community where we see many people who choose not to show their face, for example, on social media for fear of being subjected to additional, abuse. On a societal level, it is censorship. So we are seeing less and less diverse faces as a result. And of course, someone is not going to want to show their face online if then it is just going to be outright removed and there's no recourse for reporting it.
Well, and I remember when you first drew this to my attention, you were saying a family would post a picture on Facebook with their young son who just had his birthday, and the face would be erased. When you say violence is one of the reasons they're erasing these faces, it is the violence of a birthday party. It's the violence of a wedding party, right? And yet, so when you had the conversations with some of these big, huge companies, am I right? They were thinking, no, they were saying that you had to produce the evidence as a small nonprofit that there was a problem.
And that is still very much the bind that we're in. We're still a teeny tiny charity with very limited, I think we have the equivalent of 2 full-time members of staff. So for us to be told you need to go away and collect more evidence that we can then use to train our people and our machines on how to address this issue. And again, because we sit within the obscurities of the spectrum of appearance and disability as well. Community guidelines do have those protected characteristics named. We always, front and center of these conversations, is saying, well, we need disfigurement to be like specifically named in community standards, so that when it comes to, yes, hateful content, that it can be outright removed, so that there is an awareness amongst moderators. And then ultimately we hope that when it comes to informing the machines, that again, it's explicitly mentioned.
I don't see very much in the media about this. Yes?
No.
And so the idea that some of the largest companies the world has ever seen are requiring a nonprofit with 2 people in it to do their homework to ensure they do no harm, I just found this quite outrageous. And so if anybody is listening who has any potential influence with some of those organizations, would really welcome them to get in touch on this one. I mean, I heard a story recently, I think it was on LinkedIn, about a young man trying to get just a job at Deliveroo. So he wasn't trying to be the head of sales and marketing for, I don't know, Yahoo. And they required him to put up his phone and take a frontal photograph and from each side. And because of his disfigurement, the phone said no, he didn't have a face. So he can't get a job. It's not just that your birthday party pictures, are problematic. Anyway, do you see any sign that the disability movement, the European Disability Forum, organizations like that are actively campaigning to get some controls and regulations in place, at least across Europe, around the impact of artificial intelligence? Are they picking up on your issues, or do we keep falling between the, is this a disability thing or is this a cosmetic thing?
Again, and I could create a whole team of people whose job was to influence disabled people's organizations and movements and rights-based approaches. Again, it's constantly overlooked, and I understand the argument of the umbrella approach, the not specifically naming each type of disability that there could possibly be. I understand the premise of that, which is to be inclusive. But that is what is ultimately causing an issue for us right now, is that when it comes to recruitment for, I don't know, economic empowerment programs or policy call outs, calling for lived experience, we're always an afterthought.
Well, that's an interesting theme, always an afterthought, which presumably is why you're launching this huge campaign, the Face Equality Week, again this year. So that's going to make a big impact. I love your slogan, what my face is a masterpiece. So tell us about it. When's it happening and what do you need the people listening to us today to do?
So Face Equality Week will run from the 13th to the 19th of May. It's always in May each year, and this is our 6th international campaign. So the theme, My Face is a Masterpiece, well, it came off of several years of very heavy themes: education, stigma, human rights, and we all know how heavy the world feels right now, and we wanted to do something super celebratory and ultimately celebrate art as a tool for social good. So what we are doing is amplifying art that depicts facial difference, but also artists, creatives, celebrating the talent of the community. And we've seen more engagement than ever, both from people with lived experience, but also allies, supporters as well, because this is just a highly creative, celebratory way to show diverse faces out there in the world beyond medical spaces in art forms. So we're encouraging people, of course, to use the tagline, My Face is a Masterpiece, online. We have a photo brief coming out there into the world where we're asking people to kind of create a frame with their hands if they can, or even get a physical frame and say the line, My Face is a Masterpiece because. So really challenging that narrative that someone should not be able to celebrate their face just because it looks a little bit different to, our narrow perception of what is beautiful currently in society. So it's super, super celebratory. We're getting together with our partners, with all of the member organisations that we work with, they are putting on events, they are putting on picnics, they're putting on paint and sips, they're putting on gallery exhibits, making sure that the art that is out there in the world that depicts facial differences is seen and celebrated. So whether you're an ally or you have lived experience, get involved in the campaign. We have a whole host of resources on our website, faceequalityinternational.org, whether it's for schools, businesses, whether you are a parent, we have a parent's guide, because we know that some of these topics can be tricky to discuss at home. So yeah, we have something for everybody.
Well, it sounds fantastic. If you had an audience of 500 people in front of you and you said, hands up if you think your face is beautiful, not many people would put their hands up. Huh?
Well,
so I'm saying, so can anybody send their face, or do you have to sort of have a facial disfigurement?
Well, this is what we're trying to cut across, is the fact that, again, I guess a reason this is sidelined always is that unless you have lived experience or a family member or friend does, often this is something that you've never thought about. And yet we all feel the pressure to look a certain way. We, eating disorders, selfies, filters online, Photoshop, we all feel the pressure of beauty ideals and this very narrow perception. So we're hoping that this is an opportunity to actually bring people into that wider conversation and just recognize that this is something that ultimately affects all of us. It is just that it is heightened when you have a disfigurement and you don't fit within that neat little box. So we do hope that anybody can get involved.
Super. And of course, Valuable 500 is looking at representation in the media, as well as in their advertising and so on. So it's an opportunity to get in touch with you and find some potential models and, fellow creatives, as it were.
Absolutely. The more that we see facial difference out there in the public domain and it's normalized, it's not tokenistic, it's not even spoken about, that's the ultimate goal. When that is the case across the globe, then I will no longer have a job.
Well, excellent. Well, let's hope that happens fairly soon. Is that an appropriate response to that comment? Well, thank you very much. I have so enjoyed this. Fantastic to see the way this is all coming together. Oh, I wanted to ask you before we finish, give me some examples of the countries in which your members are operating for this campaign, because we'll have companies listening that are definitely operating in Singapore, for example. I think you've got quite an active group there. Where else?
Yes. So Latin America, we've got a group in Nicaragua. We've just welcomed a couple of new members in Mexico, India, Nepal. Smile Train are our biggest, most global member. They operate on every corner of the planet. But we are actively seeking new members, particularly those that can increase our footprint in low to middle income countries. At present, we have a lot of members in the US, which is great, but we would absolutely welcome more people to apply to be part of the alliance. And we want to, of course, reach the most underrepresented, underserved members of the community. So we're actively thinking more at the moment about how we work more closely with grassroots groups and individuals as well.
Well, and I'm hoping that some of the major international disability organizations, the NGOs, are listening and can start to ask questions at grassroots level in the countries in which they're operating in Africa, Asia, wherever, to start to reach out to the local groups that actually should join Face Equality International. They just didn't know they had this opportunity. So that's the next step there. Super. All right. Well, I look forward to celebrating with you in May. Have a great campaign, and we'll talk soon. Thank you very much. If you found this content relevant and perhaps even thought-provoking, please feel free to share with your networks.